As you see, we are speaking about Manot Cave. When I say modern human, everybody think about ourselves sitting here at the auditorium, but it's quite a hard definition, and there is...
In spring 2008, a bulldozer punched through a roof chimney above a cave whose main entrance had collapsed roughly 30,000 years earlier. Inside was a Homo sapiens skull, at least 54,700 years old. A later foot healed after a disabling Lisfranc fracture, and nearly 20,000 years after the skull, a torchlit hall centered on a 28-kilogram engraved stone. None belonged to one frozen moment. So what exactly had workers opened beneath the hills of the Western Galilee? The bulldozer that missed the door. The bulldozer did not find the cave's entrance. It punched through a roof chimney that no living person knew was there. Construction had begun near the village of Manot in the Western Galilee, Israel, in spring 2008. As heavy machinery cut into the hillside, it accidentally breached the roof of an enormous underground chamber. The opening used by its prehistoric inhabitants was somewhere else entirely, and had already disappeared beneath collapsed rock. Manot Cave lies approximately 9 kilometers east of the present Mediterranean shoreline and 220 meters above sea level. Beyond the accidental opening was an elongated main hall connected to several side chambers, some divided by massive mineral formations. It was less like entering a single hidden room and more like breaking into a buried underground landscape. Archaeologist Omri Barzilai of the Israel Antiquities Authority investigated the cave alongside Ofer Mada of Ben-Gurion University and Tel Aviv University paleoanthropologist Israel Hershkovitz. Their work eventually revealed that its main entrance had collapsed roughly 30,000 years ago, apparently making the interior inaccessible until the construction breach. That does not mean the cave was proven to be perfectly airtight for exactly 30,000 years. The defensible conclusion is narrower. The entrance people had used in prehistory collapsed around that time, cutting off normal human access and preserving archaeological material in separated areas. Those divisions mattered. Archaeologists use what is called site formation analysis, which means studying how human activity, sediments, mineral growth, and natural collapse created the deposits found today. Tools, animal bones, ash, and food remains can show where people worked, cooked, and slept. Rockfall and mineral formations reveal how those spaces changed after people left. Most of Manot's dense domestic remains accumulated near the original entrance. That was the bright, practical part of the cave, where its occupants could make tools, butcher animals, and maintain fires. Yet the object that made Manot famous was discovered away from those living floors. A partial human skull was recovered from Area J, a side chamber extending from the northern or northeastern side of the principal cave. Its isolated position meant researchers could not safely connect it with the tools and occupation layers found elsewhere. The skull might have belonged to a completely different period of the cave's history. The collapsed entrance explains why Manot remained inaccessible into modern times, but not why its first famous object came from Area J, away from the dense living floors. That separation became stranger when uranium-thorium testing showed the skull was not merely old, it predated the cave's main occupations by thousands of years. How much older was Manot 1 than the people who later made the cave their home? The skull older than the settlement? The answer was at least 54,700 years. Calcite associated with Manot 1 made the skull thousands of years older than the cave's main occupation floors. Manot 1 is a partial calvaria, the upper portion of a skull, rather than a complete cranium or skeleton. Researchers analyzed calcite that had formed in association with the fossil using uranium-thorium dating, usually shortened to UTHET dating. The method measures the radioactive decay of uranium trapped inside calcite. Once that mineral layer forms, its uranium begins changing at a predictable rate, allowing scientists to estimate when the calcite developed. The result was 54.7 thousand years, with a margin of error of 5.5 thousand years. One limitation is crucial. The team dated the associated calcite, not the skull bone itself. For that reason, the most accurate description is a minimum UTHET age of 54.7 plus or minus 5.5 thousand years, not a precise date of death. That still places Manot 1 well before most of the cave's documented domestic occupations, which occurred between approximately 46,000 and 33,000 years ago. The skull's owner cannot automatically be treated as a member of the communities that later left tools, animal remains, and living floors near the entrance. Age was only part of the discovery. Researchers also examined its morphology, the measurable shapes and anatomical traits of the skull, and compared them with recent African humans, earlier modern humans from the Levant and European Upper Paleolithic specimens. Their conclusion was clear. Manot 1 was unequivocally Homo sapiens. Its shape displayed similarities to recent African skulls and to modern humans who lived in Europe much later, making it an important potential marker in the expansion of our species from Africa toward Eurasia. The peer-reviewed description appeared online in Nature on January 28, 2015. Israel Hershkovitz, a paleoanthropologist associated with Tel Aviv University's Dan David Laboratory and Steinhardt Museum, argued with his colleagues that the population represented by Manot 1 could have been closely related to the modern humans who later successfully colonized Europe. Could have been is essential. No published DNA from Manot 1 established its exact ancestry, and its isolated context prevents researchers from securely pairing it with later artifacts. The skull is also not a proven Neanderthal-human hybrid, despite the tempting headlines that such an interpretation can produce. Most importantly, Manot 1's owner did not necessarily see the later engraved boulder, enter the proposed gathering chamber, or even encounter the people whose domestic remains filled the entrance area. Those discoveries belong to a later chapter of the cave. If the skull was not a hybrid, what does its location actually prove about the meeting of two human populations? The corridor where two human populations overlap. The location proves overlap, not interbreeding. Manot 1 places an unequivocally modern Homo sapiens in the southern Levant during the same broad period as nearby Neanderthals. That region formed a natural corridor between Africa and Eurasia. Anyone moving north from Africa into Western Asia would have passed through or near the Levant, making it one of the most important migration routes in human prehistory. Manot 1's minimum age of 54.7 plus or minus 5.5 thousand years falls within the broader period from approximately 60,000 to 40,000 years ago, when the ancestors of most living non-African humans expanded successfully from Africa. When the fossil was described in 2015, the Nature research team presented it as filling an important gap in the southern Levant's human fossil record. Neanderthals were not hypothetical neighbors. Their remains had been documented at specific sites in the same broader region, including Manot Cave and Kabaara Cave. Manot, therefore, placed a modern human inside a narrow geographical corridor during a period when Neanderthal populations were also present. That is powerful evidence of regional contemporaneity, but contemporaneity simply means existing during the same broad period. It does not prove that the owner of Manot 1 stood face-to-face with a Neanderthal, shared a campsite, or had children with one. If modern humans and Neanderthals occupied the same narrow corridor during the same broad period, how much contact could occur without leaving a fossil that records it directly? Genetic evidence confirms that interbreeding happened somewhere. People living outside Africa today generally inherited a small proportion of their DNA from Neanderthals, showing that the ancestors of those populations encountered and reproduced with them. The date and location of Manot make the Levant a plausible setting for some form of interaction. Still, Manot 1's classification came from cranial morphology, not DNA. No published genetic sequence from the skull identifies its owner as a hybrid, a direct participant in interbreeding, or an ancestor of any specific later population. The evidence, therefore, operates at three levels. It supports the conclusion that modern humans and Neanderthals occupied the same broader region and period. It makes direct interactions somewhere in that corridor plausible. It does not prove that interbreeding occurred inside Manot Cave or that Manot 1 ever encountered a Neanderthal. That restraint makes the fossil more valuable, not less. Instead of forcing Manot 1 into a dramatic hybrid story, researchers can use it as a secure geographical marker. An anatomically modern human had reached this corridor at a crucial point in the expansion of our species. Regional overlap establishes possibility, not personal identity. Manot 1 contains no published DNA, revealing whom its owner met or descended from. But the cave later yielded smaller human remains carrying a more complicated anatomical signal. What did 6 teeth and 7 bones from a single foot reveal about Manot's later occupants? 6 teeth and a foot that healed. The later remains did not reveal a neat, hybrid population. 6 teeth produced equivocal signals, while 7-foot bones recorded a young adult's healed Lisfranc fracture. Dental anthropologist Rachel Sarig of Tel Aviv University and her colleagues examined 6 teeth from Manot's early Upper Paleolithic deposits. 4 were preserved well enough for detailed traditional analysis and geometric morphometrics, a technique that places digital landmarks on anatomical structures to compare their shapes mathematically. One specimen, the MC9 upper premolar, was classified as probably modern human. Another, MC7, was a deciduous lower second molar, a childhood or baby tooth with a possible Neanderthal affiliation. That sounds dramatic, but the study's authors described the results as equivocal. 6 teeth, only 4 of which received detailed analysis, are too small a sample to identify an entire population. A tooth with possible Neanderthal-like morphology does not establish that its owner was a hybrid or that a mixed community occupied Manot. Published in the November 2021 issue of the Journal of Human Evolution, the dental study revealed complexity rather than a simple label. The cave's later inhabitants displayed anatomical patterns that did not fit perfectly into the categories popular storytelling tends to demand. A separate analysis focused on 7 bones from the left foot of one young adult. They included the talus, calcaneus and cuboid, 3 metatarsals, and a halical sesamoid, a small bone located beneath the big toe. Most of the foot's anatomy resembled that of modern humans, although the researchers identified several Neanderthal-like patterns. More personally, the second metatarsal preserved evidence of a healed Lisfranc fracture. A Lisfranc injury damages the joints and stabilizing structures through the middle of the foot. Even today, it can make walking, standing, and bearing weight severely painful. For a mobile hunter-gatherer without surgery, crutches, or a settled food supply, the consequences could have been devastating. Could a young adult with a disabling mid-foot fracture have recovered without companions bringing food or adjusting the group's movement? The healed bone proves survival long enough for recovery. It cannot independently prove exactly how that happened. The authors nevertheless interpreted it as possible evidence of mutual responsibility. Companions may have assisted the injured person while mobility was limited. That possibility gives Manot a human dimension the skull alone cannot provide. Its occupants were not simply anatomical specimens passing through a migration corridor. They may have belonged to social groups capable of adapting their movement and sharing resources when one member could no longer keep pace. The teeth caution against simple labels, while the healed fracture turns Manot's occupants into a community rather than a collection of specimens. Still, one injured person cannot reveal how that community organized daily life. What changed when Manot began functioning like an intensively used base camp? The entrance camp that kept growing. That injured individual belonged to a cave community that was no longer merely passing through. Manot's entrance layers record repeated occupation from approximately 46,000 to 33,000 years ago. A chronology published in Science Advances in 2017 divided that history into 3 cultural phases. The earlier Marian lasted from approximately 46,000 to 42,000 years ago. The Levantine Aurignacian followed around 38,000 to 34,000 years ago, with a post-Aurignacian phase from roughly 34,000 to 33,000 years ago. Researchers built the sequence using radiocarbon dating. This method measures the radioactive carbon remaining in once living material, such as charcoal, after it stops exchanging carbon with the environment. By dating material from separate layers, archaeologists can determine which occupations occurred first and how long different traditions lasted. Daily activity was concentrated near the original entrance, especially in areas E and I. People practiced flint knapping, shaping stone tools by striking controlled flakes from a core. They butchered animals, consumed food, and repeatedly maintained combustion structures used for heat, light, or cooking. Geoarchaeology helped researchers reconstruct that pattern by studying the sediments, minerals, and spatial distribution of remains. Zoo archaeology, the analysis of animal bones to reconstruct diet and behavior, revealed how hunting also changed. Studies published in the Journal of Human Evolution in 2021 found that later Levantine Aurignacian deposits were thicker and contained a broader variety of objects. These included shells, bone tools, grinding stones, and incised bones. Animal remains also showed increased exploitation of small game, particularly birds. University of Haifa zoo archaeologist Reuven Yeshurun and his colleagues connected those remains with changing hunting, processing, and settlement behavior. Birds and other small animals often require different capture and preparation strategies from large game, suggesting that Manot's occupants were broadening how they used the surrounding landscape. Thicker deposits do not reveal an exact population count, nor can they prove that everyone remained in the cave continuously. They do support a cautious interpretation of more intensive, extended, or repeated seasonal occupation, potentially involving larger gatherings. Across approximately 13,000 years, Manot was used by changing communities rather than one timeless population of cave people. Its entrance became a domestic center filled with the debris of ordinary life. One spatial contradiction remained. Those practical remains stayed close to the entrance, yet people also traveled beyond the living area and into a far darker section where archaeologists found almost no comparable domestic waste. By the Levantine Aurignacian, thicker deposits, more varied objects, and increased bird exploitation suggest people were using Manot more intensively, but their domestic debris remained near the entrance. If people were not living there, why did they carry tools, antler, and firelight into the darkest chamber? The torchlit hall, around a 28-kilogram stone. They carried firelight inward because Area H was not another campsite. It was a 100-square-meter gallery, approximately 20 meters high, organized around an intentionally engraved 28-kilogram boulder. Areas A, H, and K occupied Manot's deepest, darkest section. Area K was hidden behind a curtain-like speleothem formation, one of the stalagmites, stalactites, and mineral curtains created as dissolved minerals accumulate inside caves. Unlike entrance areas E and I, these chambers lacked comparable flint waste, butchered bones, food debris, and maintained hearths, yet they were not empty. Researchers found a complete fallow deer antler with use wear in Area K, suggesting that at least one object had been carried there and handled. The most striking object stood in a niche inside Area H. Made from dolomite, the boulder weighed 28 kilograms and measured 29 by 22 by 25 centimeters. Its engraved face was oriented toward the larger gallery, where anyone entering the chamber could see it. Chevrons and polygonal patterns extended across three faces. Omri Barzilai of the Israel Antiquities Authority, Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University, and their colleagues interpreted the three-dimensional form as a possible tortoise, although its exact meaning remains unknown. The researchers described it as the only engraved Upper Paleolithic boulder currently documented in the Levant. If Area H was merely practical space, why position that unique engraved boulder where a crowd could face it? Before proposing an answer, the team had to establish that the lines were artificial. Natural erosion can score rock, so researchers compared the boulder's grooves with weathered surfaces elsewhere in the cave. They mapped the lines using 3D topographic cross-sections and scanning confocal microscopy, which uses focused light to build a detailed three-dimensional image of a surface. Microscopic examination exposed linear scratches consistent with tool movement. Researchers then used flint tools to carve comparable dolomite. Their experimental grooves measured approximately 30 to 50 millimeters long, 2 to 10 millimeters wide, and 5 to 9 millimeters deep. Producing one groove took more than an hour under dry conditions. Both the replicas and ancient examples displayed straight, V-shaped profiles. Together, the microscopic scratches, profile shape, and experiments supported intentional carving rather than accidental damage. Dating the artwork required another chain of evidence. Researchers drilled 10 uranium-thorium samples from the boulder, including 8 from calcite crust inside the grooves. Mineral growth placed the engraving within a broad bracket, later than approximately 59,300 years ago, but earlier than roughly 27,800 years ago. The logic is similar to trapping an action between two timestamps. Calcite beneath, or cut by a groove, formed before the engraving, while calcite covering it formed afterward. The carving must have been made between those mineral events. Stable oxygen, award, and carbon isotope comparisons narrowed the likely period. Stable isotopes are chemical signatures that can match mineral layers formed under similar environmental conditions. The groove calcite matched cave formations deposited around 37,000 to 35,000 years ago. Calcite associated with the fallow deer antler also aligned with approximately 35,000 years ago. The multidisciplinary study was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on December 9, 2024. Its dates place the chamber's use nearly 20,000 years after Manot 1, confirming that the skull's owner and the people who gathered around the boulder belonged to widely separated episodes. Darkness created one more problem. Anyone reaching Area H needed portable light. The researchers tested 5 stalagmites for microscopic combustion residue. Only stalagmite number 1048, standing approximately 5 meters from the boulder, contained carbon-rich particles in a mineral layer dated to around 36,000 years ago. Backscattered electron imaging used reflected electrons to distinguish materials within the microscopic sample. Energy dispersive spectroscopy then identified the chemical elements in those particles. The results were consistent with combustion residue, possibly left by portable torches or brief fires. No permanent hearth was identified in the chamber. That absence suggests people brought temporary light inward rather than maintaining an ordinary domestic fire there. Area H could also hold a substantial gathering. Using an estimate of 0.93 square meters per person, the team calculated space for approximately 100 people. Acoustic testing measured a reverberation time of roughly 0.7 to the 1.2 seconds. The time sound remains audible after its source stops. That range was compatible with understandable speech and group listening. None of this proves the chamber was artificially constructed, that Neanderthals participated, or that its acoustics demonstrate religion. Ritual compound is the research team's interpretation based on spatial separation, intentional engraving, portable lighting, dating, capacity, and sound. The ceremony's name, beliefs, and the possible tortoise's meaning remain lost. The defensible conclusion is still remarkable. Around 37,000 to 35,000 years ago, people entered a non-domestic area deep inside Manot, illuminated it, and focused activity around an object that had demanded hours of deliberate carving. The engraved stone, experimental tool marks, dated calcite, carbon particles, and measurable acoustics cannot reveal the ceremony's name or the carving's certain meaning. Together they show that the deepest chamber served a different purpose from the entrance cap. What they found in a cave, inaccessible for roughly 30,000 years, seems as if it shouldn't exist in one place. A 54,700-year-old Homo sapiens and, nearly 20,000 years later, a torchlit gathering hall centered on a 28-kilogram engraved boulder. Was that chamber a local sanctuary or a meeting place shared by several communities? Comment with your theory down below.